as we try to tackle these challenges. When I became CEO in 2008, it was the height of the financial crisis, and I had come in from the outside as the first external CEO for Unilever. And it was clear to me that the crisis that we were going through was not just a financial crisis, but a crisis that had many other dimensions. High levels of government debt and private debt, overconsumption, leaving too many people behind. And having to put in place again a long-term growth model for Unilever, I actually did nothing else than going back to the roots of the company when Lord Lever started it and had as mission to make hygiene commonplace. We decided to translate that in today's terms, making sustainable living commonplace. I figured that in order to run a long-term business model, we had to run a multi-stakeholder model away from the myopic focus on the shareholder, which had also crept into Unilever, and create space for our organization to try to maximize or optimize is probably the better word, the return on all of the stakeholders. That also required us to ensure that we had a business model that had a positive influence on society, not just CSR, which often is in the less bad camp or parts of your operations, but really putting it at the core of our business to have a business model that would actually decouple our growth from environmental impact and the business model that would maximize its social impact. Lots of skepticism at that point in time, not easy to do. Unlike now, 10, 12 years ago, we did not have that many facts. Now we can show that it actually drives organizational performance, but we had to create that, obviously, that data, create that dialogue with the financial community. And the biggest, the opportunities were enormous. There's no question about it. Addressing the world's problems is actually infinite growth for many of the companies. For us, it resulted in continuous top and bottom line growth over the 10 years and a 300% return on for our shareholders as well. So it was actually a very profitable plan in the end, but it was profits through purpose, not profit with purpose or profit first. And the challenges that we encountered, perhaps, despite all these achievements, is that first and foremost, although our plan was being hailed as very aggressive and courageous, in hindsight and looking at where the world is now, it probably didn't go far enough. And even I regret that we did not do some things quicker. What I found was that about 40 to 50% can be done by companies themselves. Then another 20% more or less if the industry would work together. But ultimately, you also need the governments to put the right frameworks in place and regulations, enforcement, if you want to. And that, unfortunately, is missing in many parts of the world. And that is most likely where the bigger challenges are as we try to drive the systems changes that are needed.
So, obviously, Unilever is a very large organization, lots of people. Did you think or find that the biggest barrier to change were the people who were already there? How did you change their direction, their sort of trajectory?
Well, we actually found surprising to some extent that when we put this purpose, what we call the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, firmly in the middle of the company and made that our strategy, our business model, it created a lot of energy. Not only from the younger people in the organization, which already are more purpose-driven, but also actually from the senior levels. More importantly, it also attracted people from the outside who wanted to work with us. Our relationships dramatically changed in our value chain with civil society, etc. And soon we found that it was so motivating that we were the third looked up company on LinkedIn. Our employee engagement was in the top of the top tercile. And in most countries, also in India, where we were not anymore amongst the 10 top employers, we rapidly moved back to become the desired employer in the 50 markets, more or less, that we measured. So the resistance internally was not as high as you might expect. But it is important to point out that we first and foremost provided the space, stop doing quarterly reporting, put our compensation systems to the longer term, stop giving guidance. So creating the space for our people to make the right long-term decisions. We also put the needed measurements in place. We looked at our total impact of our business across the value chain, not only in our own operations, but also in our suppliers, up to the farmers, our influence on biodiversity. And we measured all of that for each of our brands. So we could see where we could have the biggest impact on waste, on water, on energy, on packaging, etc. So we put detailed plans in place to actually move that forward. And as we put the plans and the capabilities in place, we not only found quite rapidly that we were generating quite a lot of funds to reinvest in the business, but also that our business was better run. A factory with zero waste has better customer service, higher motivation, better product quality. So if you start to look at these things as an ecosystem, it actually pays off. And I cannot remember too many decisions I had to take in Unilever in my 10 years as CEO, where I really had to think about the major trade-offs. There's no question that you have to invest in some things before you get a return, also in sustainability, not different from investing in a factory or IT systems or training, but it is also clear that increasingly these returns on these investments are incredibly attractive. And companies that understand that will do well. Companies that are still behind or reluctant to make that transformation, I think will struggle in the years to come.
So do you believe that this type of transformational change can only happen in an organization if the top management, the CEO, chairman, believe in this and make it their agenda?
I hate to say yes. I've learned that the say-do gap is enormous in this world. And I also know that for people lower down in the organization, it is sometimes more difficult to make these trade-offs or to deal with these pressures. But if the commitment isn't firmly there from the top, I don't think you will go at the speed and scale that is needed. Sure, technology and common sense and the quest for savings might drive you in some of the directions that we are talking. But what we need is this true step change in our business models. And that requires a commitment from the top beyond the level of feeling comfortable, to be honest. It has to be embedded as a core part of the strategy. I would argue it has to be the strategy of an organization. If that purpose isn't put back firmly in the center of what the organization stands for, you won't be able to motivate and attract the employees. You won't be able to work properly with your suppliers, and ultimately it gets translated in suboptimal business results. We've seen it in some areas, for example, where the senior management has delegated inclusion, as an example, to the HR department. And when they're called upon to explain what their company does, they carefully read from a sheet of paper. These companies are increasingly being called out. We have seen companies where CEOs write wonderful letters or sign up to big statements, but if they don't personally take ownership and integrate it into their organizations, I think then increasingly these companies are exposing themselves in this age of transparency. A very quick example of that is the Business Roundtable, where 188 companies in the US now signed this sort of famous multi-stakeholder promise statement about a year ago. 1 year later, people are saying, where are we now with these companies? There are 220 companies now that have signed that statement, but you see no noticeable difference in their climate actions versus a comparable group that didn't sign. You see no noticeable actions in terms of providing the social aspect of ESG in these companies. They've not done any better on Black Lives Matter or providing social safety networks around their organizations or value chains. And then people are starting to ask questions. Increasingly, companies are unfortunately forced to change by their employees. Companies like Amazon would never have been so aggressive on climate change as they are now, were it not for 8,000 employees that threaten to walk out. Other employees will say, I don't want you to deliver mattresses to the Mexican border where families are separated from their children. Other company employees are saying, I don't want you to give face recognition equipment to a government when it intrudes on our privacy. So increasingly, I think this activist voice of society is coming to the foreground. And my point has simply been, it's not only an enormous business opportunity and economic opportunity to go to this more sustainable and equitable business model, but it's also better to be proactive instead of being forced into it, because you'll never get the credit for what you do.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful way to look at it, and you're absolutely right that the modern movements on equity have really upended many business models. You know, one of the criticisms for lots of companies is that companies will do something themselves because they have control over it, but they don't have enough control over their supply chain. And how do you really ensure a supply chain that is as sustainable as you want to be yourself?
Well, the supply chain is obviously more difficult, and also in Unilever, we had to work that hard. But I don't believe in the statement that they don't have any control of their value chain. First and foremost, there's an economic relationship that often is firmer than perhaps people acknowledge. But secondly, there's a moral obligation. You cannot outsource your value chain and also expect to outsource your responsibilities. That doesn't work anymore. If Unilever is in the food business with brands like Kisam, for example, or Knorr or other things, if we're in the food business, that means that we also have to take responsibility of ensuring that we don't destroy the biodiversity, deforestation, that we ensure that the farmers earn a decent living. We need to ensure that we don't use up the resources like depletion of the soil or water. We need to ensure the issues of stunting are not happening, that food is not wasted, or on the other side, obesity that is happening now increasingly with or overweight with people simply eating too much. We are responsible for that. Some of that is in our control in the way we advertise, the way we market our products, the things we put in our products, but also the responsibilities in the value chain. If I don't ensure that my value chain is free of slave labor or child labor, and I don't work hard to try to achieve that, then I'm responsible for the tragedies related to this. If I continue to keep my smallholder farmers in poverty, I will never have a robust value chain to run my business, and I don't want to be responsible for that. A simple rule, I think, is the golden rule that you find in any religion: do unto others and the planet as you'd like to have done unto yourselves. And that's a very simple operating principle as a starting point for CEOs to look at. Now, sometimes it's difficult. We're working now with the fashion industry, and they've been hard hit by the COVID crisis, unfortunately. They need to move to regenerative cotton. No industry can do, no business can do that alone because they are too small. But they know they have to go to regenerative cotton because otherwise it's pretty quickly the end of the story. And consumers are demanding that. So in that case, you make it pre-competitive. You put the industry together with key players who are hopefully responsible enough. And I find from my experience that you don't need more than 20-30% of an industry, and you create tipping points and you move to regenerative cotton. No company alone can solve the issue of plastics in the ocean. It's a tragedy of the commons. Ultimately, it will need governments and the right regulations and price mechanisms and incentives to fix it. But nothing prevents a group of companies to get together and set up recycling mechanisms in places, or to put R&D behind inventing alternatives to avoid these issues. So if you cannot do it alone, if you cannot achieve it in your value chain, you might even go to broader coalitions at industry level or beyond to solve these issues, because you know ultimately these issues are coming back into your businesses, and you're going to pay the price for that. And if these societies don't function, your business is not going to be successful either. So you do have to take responsibility. I find it very unfortunate that Unilever issued now twice a human rights report on the challenges that we have and the opportunities of addressing the human rights issues in the value chain. And no other company is willing to do that. How can we not take responsibility of all the people that make our business model successful? I frankly don't understand that. I find that actually an issue of morality, but increasingly it is also shown to make more economic sense. Companies that are more diverse and have more diversity in their value chain are performing better. Companies that treat their employees better and provide safety nets around them, as we've seen in COVID as well, have probably less mental health issues and higher engaged workforces. So if the CEOs, that's why it's important that the CEOs take charge of that, they have the opportunity to see this broader picture, to do this system thinking. And if they think of this holistically, they will see that their businesses will be so much better for this. And the financial market is starting to discover that as well, is able increasingly to put a value on that and start to judge companies on where they will invest and where they won't invest.
Yeah. In fact, I wanted to ask you that exact question on the financial markets and their role in transforming companies and value chains, etc. I mean, more and more we hear that banks and financial institutions are concerned about ESG record of companies, that they will only lend to companies who have that record. And even though in the past, for instance, the World Bank had said that we will not give money for dams, we'll not give money for coal-fired power plants, but there are other financial institutions that do. So how do you see the financial institution being a big driver for this change?
Well, let me first say that when it comes to the energy transition, which is absolutely key also for India, by 2030, India will account for 40% of the incremental demand of energy. So you're going to play a very important role. And the financial institutions or banks, which are still there, that would be financing coal plants, are taking an enormous risk. First of all, it's rapidly disappearing from many parts of the world. Under the Trump administration, more coal plants have closed than under all the other administrations combined. The technology has now been developed that in 70–80% of the world, alternative green energy is now cheaper than fossil. So why are you going to take the risk of stranded assets, of liabilities, of extra costs into your business models? For many of the financial institutions that are smart enough, it's not worth anymore. And here is a statistic. If we just look at the last 4 years alone, we've seen the fossil fuel industry losing market value or market cap by about 50%. And the green energy has actually increased their combined market value by 50%. Companies like in Europe, like Enel or Iberdrola or Engie, who have actually actively made the conversion, Ørsted made the conversion to green energy, are the good performers. Whilst the trailers, and they still are, the Shells or the BPs or some of the other ones that have not made that conversion, have seen their market cap be hammered. The financial market understands that. The decarbonization movement is rapidly taking hold, where we now have over $4 trillion of money under management, having made a commitment to decarbonize their portfolio. And frankly, I would do the same. The alternatives are there. They're cheaper, they're better, they're less risk. It's interesting to see that venture capital now, the biggest growth area in venture capital has been green energy. In the last 7–8 years, over $60 billion has gone into venture capital money has gone into green energy. Not much has gone into the fossil industry. So we've made that tipping point, I believe, and companies that are trailing because of their own self-interest, because perhaps of lousy thinking of protecting the status quo, are taking great risks for their shareholders, are taking great risk for their companies.
Yeah. You know, just a few days ago at the virtual UN summit, China announced that they were going for net zero carbon by
Correct.
2060. And I think that got everybody very, very surprised and very excited at the same time. And how do you see this competition for decarbonization around the world? between the US, Europe, China, Japan, India?
Well, it's mixed, would be the right thing to say right now. Clearly, China has put a stake in the ground by 2060. That country is run by engineers, so this goes on spreadsheets and they will do it. But I also think that China will soon discover that they need to be earlier. If we want to stay below 1.5 degrees warming, we need to reduce the absolute emissions by 50% every 10 years. And it leads you to net zero by 2050. A combination of the technology development and the needs that we will have in the world will probably drive China to a more aggressive target, but at least the stake is set in the ground. Most of the fossil fuel investments have a long lead time. If you look at exploration and investments, you're talking 30, 40 years. And here there's a clear signal now that those investments are becoming significantly less attractive. China still has an issue of their energy demand that needs to be fulfilled, and they're still building coal plants. So the first priority now, like in India, is to get out of building these coal plants, which are absolutely devastating for climate change. And again, there are alternatives now, and money is abundantly available in the world, and we should be pushing for that. In the US, we've had a government that outright was obstructive to climate change, obstructive in many other areas, if I may say, without becoming political. But nevertheless, we've seen that about 75% of the US economy is making commitments on climate change. They're actually running ahead of their Paris Agreement commitments. And that is happening at the state level, at the city level, and many companies. You've seen the companies from the Microsofts to the Salesforces to the Walmarts, all making gigaton commitments on becoming net zero. So I think the change in administration, if that will happen, would be a positive thing. Because unfortunately, with a lot of the issues that we haven't addressed over the last 10 years or since the financial crisis, the issues of inequality, the issue of climate change that is closely related, the issues of exclusion. We have eroded the middle class in many countries. We have eroded democracy. It often got translated at the polls in terms of populism or nationalism. We've seen it in places like Mexico or Brazil or Russia and other places. And by the way, that has not been very conducive for global cooperation. We missed a big opportunity in the financial crisis when only about 2.5% of the money that we put in went to greening our global economies. So we're fighting very hard to ensure that it is better this time. It's not done yet. It's early days. Lots of the money that we have spent, 12 trillion until now, has gone to saving lives and stabilizing economies and providing safety nets. But now that we're starting to see on how do we build back better, it is important that most of these investments go into greening. Otherwise, we get into a virtuous circle that is difficult to get out of. I'm positive if the presidency changes in the US, that we will see a renewed effort globally in terms of cooperation between the major powers, including India, and accelerate the commitments on climate.
Yeah, I think currently Europe has the best thought out green growth plans. And I suppose they are making good headway now, despite the fact that, you know, you have differences within the markets of different countries in Europe.
Europe is complex. They've made a commitment with the Green Deal now to move to 55%. Interestingly, it was business that pushed the European Commission to move from 50 to 55%. We don't think that's still ambitious enough, but it's a good starting point. And then with the Green Deal, you also have the farm to fork, the biodiversity, and the circular economy package. So there is a holistic policy change. Europe is complex. It needs to be implemented in each of the individual member state countries. And there is obviously still a challenge ahead that we should not disregard. But having said that, the ambitions coming out of Brussels are there, and they have full support from us. Don't forget that when the spending was made in Europe to rescue these economies because of COVID, again, we saw the initial reactions of countries to invest in old industries to keep them alive, whilst a very few, exception being Germany and France, we're actually making some of these bailouts conditional. And so Europe still has a long way to go. And here again, the business community, the ICC, and many others created strong coalitions to ensure that we have this green recovery. It is interesting, but most likely this COVID pandemic will destroy more jobs than we've seen in any time in history, sadly enough. The ILO estimates, Kai Ryder, that about 500 million job equivalent hours have been lost to date, 70 million people pushed back into poverty. Much of that job loss is actually amongst the young people. In India, you run the risk that 30 to 40% of the smaller SMEs might disappear because of the pressure coming in. So we will see a big job destruction. And the priority actually is to create jobs, to ensure that we have this social cohesion, to ensure that societies continue to function and that we don't see this dysfunctional governance coming out of this. So job creation is the most important thing. And why should we not strive for an economic policy that generates more jobs, better jobs, more resistant jobs, and better paying jobs? And it happens to be that moving to a green economy hits all those things. It's a better return on your investment. It generates more jobs and more resilient jobs. Just greening the economy and taking care of biodiversity or greening the infrastructure. The World Economic Forum, with a task force on business for nature, estimates that that can generate 380 million jobs. Greening your buildings, moving to green mobility, electrifying mobility out of the combustion engine, protecting biodiversity, changing our grid system, all these things, looking at infrastructure in cities, etc. All these things are enormous job generating opportunities that we should invest in. And India actually has an advantage because India doesn't have a innovator's dilemma, or they can still design it properly as you move forward. So how do we design a more resilient food system is still an issue that's very important in India. How do we provide a social safety network, a healthcare system, an infrastructure system that gives water, sanitation, and anything to the people is still something that you can develop from scratch in India. How do you build your infrastructures, both in rural and in urban areas, is still something that India can design. So you have a competitive advantage, in my opinion, to design it right, to make the standard for green manufacturing, to make the standard for avoiding land degradation, for green agriculture. And that is a huge opportunity for people that understand that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Just the last question is really about your motivations to start Imagine and what you expect to be able to achieve there.
Well, what I found in Unilever was we achieved quite a lot in Unilever to be proud of. The people did and still do an enormous job to set a standard that a multi-stakeholder, longer-term business model is ultimately also good for the planet, but also good for the shareholders. But I also found that there are some limitations to what companies can do alone. And you're always being seen still as a CEO of your company, defending the interest of that company. There are competitive pressures. There are time limitations or knowledge gaps. So what Imagine does is very simple. Imagine looks at the two most burning issues in society, inequality and climate change. And its theory of change is if we can get enough CEOs together by industry sector across a value chain, we can actually drive tipping points. Specifically, we have brought 30 CEOs together of the biggest companies in food across the value chain. When they are together, they become more courageous and they are able to attack the bigger issues like how do we turn agriculture into a carbon positive versus carbon negative. We will not solve climate change without changing agriculture. There's no question about it. Issues like how do we ensure livelihoods for smallholder farmers. So Imagine is bringing these coalitions together to work these pre-competitive issues with these courageous collectives to drive the tipping points. What we find is that when we have the 20-30% of the sector there, It attracts others. Other companies want to be part of it. Civil society wants to be involved. Governments want to participate. And then we de-risk the political process and put the right frameworks in place as well. A good example is the Green Deal that you just mentioned. Frans Timmermans, who is the Vice President for Europe in charge of this, cannot deal with every individual company knocking on its door. And frankly, the interest of these individual companies are often different and not consistent. But bringing this collective together, we are working on the common objectives and moving it forward constructively at a faster pace than otherwise would have been the case. We've had a big food security issue in East Africa with locusts, with climate change, with COVID. We're working with Agnes Kalibata on AGRA and the African Coalition with all of the food companies. Individual companies will say, well, these governments wear me out. They're bureaucratic. I can't get through. I can't get my things implemented. Or other CEOs will say, well, it's not my issue. I can make fertilizer available or seeds, but it's somewhere else in the value chain that the bottleneck is. By putting, again, the whole value chain together, by doing it at CEO level, we can do in 6 months what would have taken us 5 years. So it's all about this accelerated implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate your very, very direct and forthright answers, and by leading by example and changing the world as you go along. Thank you very much for your chat this afternoon, and we look forward to meeting you again in India again soon once this pandemic is over. Thank you.
Look forward to that, and thanks for what you're doing, and good luck with all the companies. This is India's moment, no question.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Yeah, Purali.
Yeah. That's only. But GC didn't happen in Fireside.
Sir. Thank you, sir, for a wonderful session. Now we'll proceed to the next session, the session on green entrepreneurship. There's a panel discussion on green entrepreneurship from 2 o'clock onwards till 3 o'clock. Mr. Pradeep Doble will be chairing the session. As said, please go on to the main conference page and please refresh if it says that the session has not started. We'll start at 13:45 and people can start joining. Thank you everyone for giving us the time. We would formally end the session.